In 2001, one of Yosemite's most trusted rangers vanished during a routine patrol, and for 8 years, no one knew why. That single event became one of the park's darkest mysteries, a story whispered among rangers, told in quiet voices over late night radios. Her name was Claire Hensley, a veteran ranger known for her calm under pressure, her precise reports, and her strange fondness for the loneliest trails. She loved the silence of the backcountry, the places tourists never reached, where wind and rock were the only witnesses. For Claire, solitude wasn't isolation, it was belonging. That's what made her disappearance so haunting. It was a clear autumn evening. The granite cliffs still glowed faintly gold in the dying light, and the air carried the sharp chill of the first snow waiting in the high peaks. Inside Yosemite's small dispatch room, the lights hummed softly. Rick Latham, the dispatcher on duty, leaned over his console, running through the nightly check-ins. Every ranger answered in order: call signs, coordinates, routine replies. Then came the last name on the list. Ranger 6, Claire Hensley, radio check. Static. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. Ranger 6, do you copy? Nothing. He frowned. Usually, even bad reception gave a faint click or whisper. Tonight, just dead air. Rick waited a minute, then two. He tried again, voice tighter now. Ranger 6, Yosemite Base, please respond. Still nothing. The clock on the wall ticked past 7:12 p.m. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. He looked toward the darkness beyond the pines, that endless stretch of ridges, canyons, and silence. The northern patrol routes were remote, unpredictable, easy to lose signal in. But Claire wasn't the kind to go quiet. She was precise, disciplined, dependable. If she wasn't answering, something was wrong. Rick followed protocol, logging the missed check-in, but before he made the next call, he paused, listening to the static fading from the speaker. It rose once, a faint hiss, then flattened into complete silence. Over the next days, dozens would search for her. Over the next years, one man, her father, would search alone. For nearly a decade, the wilderness offered no answers until one discovery in 2009 finally broke the silence and revealed what the mountain had been hiding all along. When the static finally stopped, so did every trace of her. Dusk slid over the northern ridges like a slow-moving shadow. The light thinned, the temperature dropped, and the wind threading through the pines turned sharp. Ranger Claire Hensley nudged her horse, Echo, along a narrow bench of trail that clung to the slope. The granite underfoot was pale and cold. The forest below fell away into a dark tangle of fir and manzanita. Her voice on the radio was steady. No strain, no hurry. Ranger 6, Northern Sector, moving past Marker 12. Trail is clear. The reply from base was routine. Received, logged, carry on. She checked her watch, glanced at the last splash of gold on the opposite wall of the canyon, and guided Echo forward. The hoofbeats were even, a soft rhythm against the crust of dry needles. She did not rush the descent. She didn't rush anything out here. This was her element. The quiet, the distance, the feeling that the park breathed slower after the visitors left. Ahead, the trail bent around a granite shoulder. A gust came up canyon. It scraped through the treetops and lifted a scatter of dust from the switchback. Claire put a gloved hand to the brim of her hat, blinked, and looked back once at the ridge she'd crossed. The sky above it was already turning a colder blue. She keyed the mic again, casual, like a habit she'd practiced for years. Approaching the cut, we'll check in at Marker 13. No stress, no hint of trouble. She clicked the radio off and rode into the bend. Back at Yosemite headquarters, the evening check-in board glowed with tiny green dots. Names and call signs moved from column to column as rangers closed their routes. The dispatcher, Rick Latham, updated the log, jotting times in the margin the way he always did. Clean numbers, a quiet ritual. The hum of the fluorescence was the only sound. 7:04 p.m. Claire's next call should land within 5 minutes. Out on the trail, the wind deepened. A thin strand of cloud dragged across the mouth of the canyon like a pale curtain. Echo's ears twitched. The first stars came out, faint and cold, pinned in the narrow slice of sky between two walls of rock. Claire guided the horse onto a shelf where the ground flattened for 20 yards. The trail cut straight through a seam of granite. She paused there, listening. The forest felt watchful, but not threatening, just the way it always did right before dark. She lifted the microphone. "Base, this is Ranger 6 at..." Static walked over her voice. It was brief, a sandpaper hiss, then clear again. She tried once more, turning the antenna a few degrees. "Marker 13, route remains clear, moving south." The transmission traveled, thinned by stone and distance, and reached the dispatch room with a small, harmless crackle. Rick penciled the time, circled it, and drew a short line toward her expected next point. Nothing out of place. Not yet. 7:12 p.m. The dispatch clock ticked in a slow, confident rhythm. Outside HQ, the pines rattled against a sudden gust. Inside, Rick switched to the nightly roll, a last sweep of calls before sign-off. One by one, the voices came through. 2 patrols already back at quarters, a maintenance ranger setting cones at the south turnout, a pair of climbers escorted down, no injuries. Routine chatter, the kind that tells you the day, despite its rough edges, is ending the way it should. Then he keyed the mic for the last call. "Ranger 6, this is base, radio check." He waited, static. He adjusted the frequency a hair, pressed again. "Ranger 6, Claire, do you copy?" Silence, not even a click. At 7:18 p.m., he logged missed with a small underline. A note to try again in 2 minutes. He tried again. Nothing. The quiet was thicker now, like the room itself held its breath. Procedures live in the bones of people who do this work. At 1 missed call, you watch the clock. At 2, you move. Rick stepped to the door and told the duty sergeant. A short exchange, no panic, just a change of temperature. The sergeant looked at the map, tapped the northern grid, and said, "Call it in." By 7:30 p.m., 2 rangers were already shrugging into jackets. Headlamps clipped low on their chests. Radios were checked, batteries swapped. Someone filled a thermos without speaking. The door opened to the cold. The forest swallowed their beams as they left the road. Light swam over bark, granite seams, and the thin thread of trail that angled into the rim's darkness. Their breath came in white pulses. Names were called in careful voices that avoided echo. Claire. Then again, softer. Claire. Only the wind answered. Across town, a phone rang in a small, neat house where maps of the Sierra were framed on the walls. Tom Hensley listened without a word, his hand flat on the table. When the caller finished, he said, "I'm on my way," and hung up. He didn't fumble with keys. He didn't ask what had already been decided. He put on a jacket that still smelled faintly of pine smoke, took a folded topo from a drawer, and drove. At HQ, he walked straight past the desk and into the map room. The duty sergeant didn't stop him. Tom had been a ranger in this building for 22 years. He knew where the lights were, which drawer stuck, which pencil was sharpened. He found the northern sector chart and bent over it, tracing the ridgeline with a finger. "She wouldn't be on the main loop at dusk," he said. more to the map than to the people around him. She hates the loose scree below the bluff. She'd cross the saddle instead. It's faster if the wind is up. He tapped a thin, unmarked line, an old stock path the printed map didn't bother with. He breathed out slowly. She'd never lose her way. The radio cracked. Search team at the trailhead, ascending to marker 11, headlamps strong. No sign. Another team rolled from the south approach, climbing switchbacks like slow-moving stars. The night settled colder. The first team reached marker 12. No scuff, no broken branch, no fresh tracks. They fanned out along the cut, boots placed with care to read the ground. Nothing. The trail looked unused, as if the day had skipped that stretch entirely. Tom stood with a pencil in his hand and marked the teams in neat small X's. He moved the X's forward in inches, the way you do when you want time to obey the map. Out in the dark, the beams skimmed the earth, searching for any pattern. The curve of a hoof, a slide of grit on stone, a dragged mark where a radio might have fallen. The light found only old sign, a weak dry buck print, a broken twig silvered by frost, the faint grid of a boot tread too small to be hers. Echo's prints should have been obvious on that dusted shelf. They were not there. Hours passed. Calls came thin and brief, practical and tired. Negative at marker 13. Switchback clear. Cross the saddle, no disturbance. The wind softened, then died, and with it the tiny sounds that make a forest feel alive. The silence returned, heavy and complete, as if the mountain had rolled a door shut. Near midnight, a team paused at the lip of a granite bowl and looked back at the valley. A string of lights, HQ, the road, the faint glow of a lodge miles away, barely touched the distance. Up here, the dark was total. One of the rangers crouched, palm flat to the stone, reading it like a page. He shook his head once and stood. Back in the map room, Tom didn't sit. He stood with both hands on the table, eyes tracking the empty spaces between the penciled lines. The radio hissed and fell quiet. The clock's second hand swept and swept. By dawn, the search had circled itself. 2 teams crossing paths at a saddle, one descending to the river cut, one pushing the ridgeline. They met bare ground everywhere. No skid mark from a fall, no shred of fabric in a snag, no iron scuff from a horseshoe on the granite lip. The trail wore only the marks the searchers themselves had made. The forest looked untouched, as if nothing and no one had passed that way in days. It felt less like a place that hid clues and more like a place that had rinsed them clean, quietly, completely. When the first thin light returned to the cliffs, it showed the same stone faces, the same black seams, the same indifferent pines. The searchers lifted their lamps off their chests and squinted into the gray. Radios murmured, plans were redrawn, new grids were drawn in pencil, but the night had already told them its single, stubborn truth. If Claire had crossed this ground, the mountain chose not to show it. Morning came gray and brittle, a thin frost whitening the meadow grass. Helicopters beat slow circles above the tree line, blades stirring mist into pale ribbons that drifted and vanished. Below, lines of rangers moved through the timber, orange vests flashing between trunks, radios murmuring coordinates. Every few minutes, someone called her name, the sound rolling down the slopes and breaking apart in the ravines. By the second day, the operation had grown into a small moving town. Base tents rose in the parking lot, steaming coffee urns beside stacks of topo maps. Volunteers arrived from nearby towns, climbers, hikers, off-duty firefighters, all eager to help. Search grids multiplied, Flagging tape fluttered from branches like warnings. For a while, hope felt solid. Each new hour meant one more place checked, one more piece of terrain crossed off the list. A footprint found near a creek brought a rush of energy. It matched the sole of a ranger boot almost, but the print was old, half filled with pine needles, a strip of torn fabric turned up in a gully, olive green like a uniform. Under a magnifier, it proved to be tint nylon, probably years weathered. The radio stayed busy, voices rising with every rumor. Then a hiker reported an aggressive black bear near the northern rim, charging without provocation. Wildlife officers logged it, discussed behavior, size, pattern. The theory took hold fast. A territorial bear, a surprise encounter, an accident turned fatal. It made the news that night. Ranger feared victim of bear attack. The words sounded simple, tidy. Tom Hensley watched that broadcast from the corner of the command tent, arms folded, jaw set. He didn't argue. He didn't have to. Anyone who had walked the same ground as his daughter knew better. Claire respected bears, carried spray, read sign like a book. A bear leaves chaos behind. There had been none. Days bled into weeks. The canyon walls turned the late autumn light, copper, then gray. Snow dusted the peaks, melted by noon, returned by night. Searchers grew thin, faces drawn from cold and frustration. By early November, the helicopter crews had logged more than 100 flight hours and found nothing but silence. The operation report called it an exhaustive effort, yielding no confirmed evidence. The next line changed everything. Due to weather and safety concerns, official search suspended pending new information. Suspended. It meant done. Tom stood by the command post door while the last crews packed gear into trucks. No one knew what to say. He gave short nods, said thank you, shook hands. When the last vehicle pulled away, he walked back inside and stared at the map still pinned to the wall. He traced the yellow route marking her patrol, the red lines of the grid, the wide white spaces between. There were so many white spaces. Winter closed the park like a door. Snow filled the canyons, covered the flagging tape, erased boot prints, erased even the idea of direction. Reporters moved on to other stories. At headquarters, the file grew thinner with every week of silence. In January, it was stamped inactive, pending new leads. A clerk filed it away between missing hikers and unresolved accidents. Another shelf in another cabinet, but Tom never filed it away. His small house at the edge of the valley slowly transformed. The dining table disappeared under maps. Every wall became corkboard, notes, photographs, coordinates, sections of satellite printouts taped edge to edge. Colored string connected ridge to ridge, route to route. He bought old survey charts from antique stores, traced forgotten logging spurs and miners' paths that no one had walked in decades. At night, he highlighted them under a desk lamp until his eyes burned. Neighbors saw him leave before dawn with a rucksack and compass. He moved through the snow like a man keeping an appointment. 3 days out, 2 days in, then out again. He wasn't reckless. He logged his routes, left notes with rangers still on duty, but every search ended the same way. Footprints fading into the same indifferent wilderness. Friends tried to talk him down. There's nothing left out there, Tom. He'd just shake his head. She knew this park. If she wanted quiet, she went where no one else did. That's where I'll find her. The seasons turned. Spring brought meltwater roaring through creeks, washing away the last sign of the search. Summer's heat baked the slopes. The air shimmered over the granite. He kept going. He learned which streams held cold water late in August, which slopes caught morning shade. He read the forest the way she had, by detail, by instinct, by feel. 5 years passed, then 6. The headlines were long forgotten. Tourists camped in the same meadows, never knowing they pitched tents above a mystery. The mountains changed little. Trees fell, new ones grew. Moss crept over old markers. The wilderness didn't remember names. It simply waited. Inside Tom's house, the air smelled of paper and pine resin. On one wall, a fresh map hung beside the rest. In the center, a small square drawn in pencil marked a place no search team had ever touched. A ravine hidden behind overlapping ridges, reached only by an unrecorded spur. He stood in front of it as dusk settled through the window. The same time of day his daughter had vanished. The lamplight trembled across the map pins. He picked up his pack, checked the compass, and whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow." The wilderness beyond his door stayed silent, vast, and unchanged. The same wilderness that had swallowed a ranger whole and kept her secret beneath its snow for another long, indifferent year. Spring came late that year. Snow still clung to the shadowed gullies, but the lower ravines had begun to breathe again, wet soil loosening, meltwater stitching clear threads through the rock. In one of those ravines, remote, unnamed on most maps, a small team of university geology students hauled in equipment that looked out of place in the wilderness: tape measures, survey flags, a blunt-nosed cart with a low antenna, a laptop in a hard case. They were there for soil science, not stories. Their professor, Dr. Lena Hart, had chosen the site because no one ever went there. That was the point. Undisturbed layers told clearer histories. The students marked a grid with orange flags, measured distance with patient steps, and pulled the cart along each line in slow, careful passes. The machine was ground-penetrating radar, GPR, humble and precise. It sent tiny pulses into the earth, then listened to the echoes. On the laptop, gray bands scrolled by. Soil, clay, gravel, like the pages of a book only a few people knew how to read. Most of it was as expected: horizontal, dull, honest. Then one student, Ben Ruiz, stopped. "Dr. Hart, can you look at this?" She bent over the screen. The bands had broken. In the middle of the cross-section, a shape sat like a dark island, solid, dense, and coherent. Not layered, not jagged, not rock. "That's unusual," Lena said, voice steady but focused. "Mark this line. We'll run a perpendicular." They dragged the cart across a new path. The shape held, same size, same depth, 4 feet down, too uniform for random debris, too dense for wood. Ben chewed his lip, eyes flicking between the screen and the flagged ground. "What is it?" another student asked. "Not sure," Lena said, "but it doesn't belong here." They set the cart aside and opened the hard case again. Different tools this time: narrow spades, trowels, brushes. No glory in the first scoop. Just wet loam and the sweet cold smell of earth. They cut a small square and began to peel the ground back, inch by inch, keeping the edges clean, the surface level. Meltwater gathered in the corners. Someone sponged it out with a camp towel. 2 feet down, the soil turned denser, compacted, deliberate. Ben switched to a hand trowel. His blade struck something that wasn't stone. The sound was a dull, almost hollow. He set the trowel aside and used his fingers, brushing mud away in small circles. A pale curve appeared beneath the brown. "Bone," Lena said quietly. They widened the pit. The curve became a long arc with a clean edge and tight texture. "Ribs." More brushing revealed a second arc beneath the first, and then a third, each rib aligned with the next, spaced like the bars of a careful instrument. There was no jumble, no scatter, no break marks from a rockfall or flood. They worked slower now, saying less. The silence of the ravine pressed in close, the kind of silence that feels like the earth listening back. How students' brush clicked gently against another shape, thicker and straighter, a leg bone, then the skull, broad, long, unmistakable in its profile, even through the sheen of wet soil. It's a horse, Lena said, and the word hung there, soft and wrong. They cleared around the feet last. Ben lifted a thin layer of packed silt and froze. Dr. Hart, here. Two rust-dark crescents sat where the front hooves would have been, edges squared, nail holes visible under a film of mud. Horseshoes, not tumbled beside the bones, not scattered by time, placed where they belonged. The entire skeleton lay in perfect side profile, as if someone had set it down gently and covered it with the earth itself. This was buried, Lena said, intentionally. She reached for the satellite phone. The call to Yosemite Dispatch traveled faster than any rumor. Within an hour, 2 senior rangers were bumping down the old logging spur in a high-clearance truck, then hiking the last half-mile with evidence tape and a canvas tarp. They stopped at the edge of the pit and said nothing for a long moment. One ranger took off his hat. Lena explained how they'd found it. The grid, the anomaly, the careful excavation. The rangers nodded in that way people do when the world confirms what they already fear. They ringed the site with yellow tape, logged coordinates, took photographs from the corners, then from above. A breeze ran down the ravine and rattled the tape in a steady, paper-thin hiss. "Hold excavation," the senior ranger said. "We wait for the forensic team." He bent at the pit's edge, studying the shoes. His face tightened. "Get me a call to the farrier," he added. Now. Word moved through the station like a current. By late afternoon, the farrier, a man who had shod park horses for decades, stood by the pit with a zippered binder under his arm. He knelt, careful not to touch the bones, and looked at the iron. Even through corrosion, he recognized the small notch he always filed in the outer edge of the left front. His habit, his signature. He checked his records against the size and nail pattern, cross-referenced dates. He closed the binder and exhaled through his nose. "These were on echo," he said. Silence met the name. It pulled the air out of the ravine for a beat, then brought it back colder. Someone radioed the station. Someone else called the detective on the cold case list. A third ranger walked a perimeter with a camera, photographing boot prints, theirs, and the clean ground beyond. No other tracks intersected the site. No drag marks, no animal sign, no teeth scoring on the bones, no violence written by nature. The news traveled outward, first along the park's quiet channels, then through county dispatch, then to the press. The headline that evening was softer than the ones from years before, but it cut deeper. Horse of missing ranger found buried in remote ravine. No speculation this time, just the one fact: the wilderness had finally surrendered. Tom Hensley arrived before dark, hat in his hands, eyes taking in the tape, the flags, the neat cut of the pit. He stood across from the farrier and nodded once in thanks, as if the man had returned something of his own. He leaned over the tape and looked down. The bones were clean lines against the earth, peaceful in their geometry. Echo, the horse his daughter had trusted with bad footing and steep descents. Tom's mouth moved and barely made a sound. She'd never leave him behind, he said. No one corrected him. Everyone understood. They briefed him on the process. Forensics would document before any movement. Soil samples would be bagged and labeled. Every layer would be recorded. The ravine was a scene now, in the strictest sense. A boundary had been drawn between guessing and proof. As dusk fell, the team erected a white canopy over the pit and hung 2 work lights from a crossbar. Moths found them and tapped the bulbs. Small, insistent beats in the larger quiet. The far range turned purple. A temperature drop came fast. Tom stayed until the lamps threw long shadows and the voices under the canopy thinned to the soft economy of work. The senior ranger walked him to the edge of the tape and spoke low. "This changes things," he said, "a lot." It changed the map of the case, the assumptions that had hardened over years, the way the mountain would be read from that night forward. An accident does not bury a horse in perfect order 4 feet down. A bear does not replace the earth like a careful mason. Someone had been here, with time, with tools, with intent. Back at headquarters, a door that had been closed opened again. The file came out of the cabinet and onto a table under bright lights. Names were added to a new whiteboard. 2001 was written at the top, then 2009 beneath it, and a line drawn between. 8 years of questions now attached to one hard fact. Detective Elena Cruz stood in the doorway and listened while a ranger briefed her, point by point. She looked at the first photograph from the ravine, the ribs, the clean angles of the shoes, and set the picture down with care. "Start the chain," she said. "Everything from that site goes straight to forensics." Out in the dark, the canopy glowed like a small moon in the ravine. Inside its light, brushes moved slowly. Labels were written in neat block letters, and soil shifted in quiet, deliberate scoops. The mountain had finally offered a sentence. Now the work would begin to read the rest of it. By morning, the park felt different. Same cliffs, same pines, but the air held a new charge, as if the ground had stepped closer. Radios carried short, clipped messages. A fresh command board went up. The long, cold case had flickered back to life, not with rumor or hope, but with bone and iron and the unmistakable mark of a human hand. The discovery did more than change the story. It set the next one in motion, and as Tom drove home through the first light, he glanced at the mountains in his mirror and whispered to no one and to the whole valley at once, "Hold on, we're coming." The phone call came before dawn. By the time Detective Elena Cruz reached Yosemite headquarters, the sun had only begun to burn through the mist that gathered above the valley floor. The building was quiet, that kind of heavy quiet reserved for news that changes everything. She walked in without ceremony, a travel mug in one hand, a file folder under the other arm. A ranger she didn't know led her down the corridor toward the evidence room. "You'll want to start with the photos," he said, holding the door. Inside, a dozen printed photographs were clipped to a corkboard, the ravine, the excavation, the white canopy glowing in the dusk. In the middle photo, the bones of the horse curved in clean arcs through dark soil, the metal of the shoes catching the flash. Beneath them, a single caption, "Echo, recovered May 3rd, 2009. Elena took a slow breath and set her coffee aside. "After 8 years, the mountain finally speaks," she murmured. By mid-morning, she was in the field. The ravine was steeper than she expected. A long fold in the land, dense with scrub oak and wild sage. The forensic tents were still up, their white panels flicking in the wind. Underneath, techs in Tyvek suits worked in near silence, brushing, labeling, cataloging. Every move was slow, deliberate. The air smelled of wet clay and alcohol wipes. She ducked under the tape and crouched beside the lead forensic anthropologist. "Show me what's left." The bones had been carefully cleaned, each laid out on blue plastic sheets in perfect anatomical order. There were no crush marks, no predator scoring, no breaks that suggested a fall. Whoever buried Echo had done so with precision and time. The animal had not been dragged, not scavenged, but what caught Elena's eye wasn't the skeleton. It was something far smaller. "Look here," said Dr. Alistair Finch, pointing at a section of the right foreleg. "We found a microfracture. Not significant at first, when under magnification we saw a glint." He reached for a Petri dish on the folding table and held it toward the light. Inside, against a white paper liner, sat a speck of gray metal, no larger than a grain of sand. Elena leaned closer. It looked harmless, insignificant. "You pulled that out of the bone?" "Embedded," Finch confirmed. "Pressure fracture at the impact site. The fragment was lodged too cleanly to be post-mortem. It happened at or near the time of death." She frowned. "A bullet?" Finch shook his head. "No lead, no copper. Composition's off. It's harder, brittle, crystalline. We're sending it to Sacramento for elemental analysis." Elena straightened, scanning the tent. Evidence techs were labeling samples: soil bags, swabs, trace fibers. Each seal clicked closed with a mechanical snap. For years, the case had been speculation and silence. Now it had something tangible, something sharp enough to cut through the dust of time. She looked back at the ravine. The way the body had been buried, careful, deliberate, didn't fit an accident. It fit a secret. Later that day, in the operations room, Tom Hensley unfolded his map across the table. It took 2 men to hold the edges flat. Layers of tape connected dozens of smaller sheets, some printed, most hand-drawn. Rivers traced in blue ink, trails in black, old mining paths in red pencil. His handwriting covered the margins: dates, elevations, notes about rockfalls and runoff. Elena studied it, quietly impressed. "He built the map the park should have had," she said. Tom's face was tired, hollowed by years of grief, but still alert. He pointed to a section of the northern grid. "This is where they found Echo. Here's where the official search stopped." His finger moved an inch west, tracing a thin, faded pencil line. "This is a forgotten trail, cut by miners in the 1880s, abandoned when the quartz gave out. Claire knew about it. She used to talk about how the terrain there still showed shovel scars." Elena marked the spot with a pushpin. "Old mining trail. That's where we start." He nodded once. She would have followed it if she thought someone was digging up there. 2 days later, the lab report arrived. Elena read it twice, eyes narrowing with each line. Composition: tungsten carbide alloy. Origin: consistent with industrial cutting tools or geological hammers. Impact signature: high kinetic force, localized. She set the report down. "Tungsten carbide," she said aloud. "That's rock hammer material." Finch nodded. "The kind used by prospectors, geologists, or artifact hunters. It doesn't belong in that context unless someone was digging." Elena leaned back in her chair, the picture assembling in her mind. Claire out on patrol, riding through the back country. Maybe she saw signs of illegal excavation, fresh tool marks, a collapsed shaft, a truck where none should be. She gets off her horse, goes to investigate. One man, surprised, panics. The hammer swings. A single strike. Not an accident, a confrontation. She turned to Tom. "Your daughter didn't just disappear. She interrupted someone." He stared at the table for a long moment. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "I told them that. They said it was a bear." "Not anymore," Elena said. Within days, the investigation had shape again. The evidence wall filled with new photos, the Petri dish, the fracture site, the terrain map. Beneath it, old ranger logs were pinned in rows, each citation Claire had written in the year before her disappearance. Most were routine: camping violations, off-trail hikers, unlicensed drones, until Elena's eyes caught a different pattern: artifact theft, unauthorized excavation, metal detector confiscations. She pulled 5 reports, all filed in the same quadrant of the park, the one marked in red on Tom's map. At the bottom of each, Claire's signature looped in, steady ink, and then a name that repeated: Caleb Voss, a local relic collector, previously fined for digging on federal land. His address sat just outside the park's western boundary. Elena circled it with a black marker, slow and deliberate. The fragment in the horse, the dig site, the old mining trails, and now a man with a history of exactly that kind of crime. Night settled over the operations room. The map glowed faintly under a desk lamp. Outside, the forest was a black ocean of pines. Elena stood at the window, arms folded, listening to the low hum of the building, printers, computers, distant radios. She wasn't sure what haunted her more: the thought of how easily this case had gone cold, or how close the truth had been all along, hiding in plain view, etched into the margins of a father's map. For the first time in 8 years, the story of Ranger Claire Hensley wasn't an echo or a rumor. It was evidence. It was purpose. It was a path leading straight toward the people who had buried the truth as carefully as they'd buried the horse. And Elena Cruz intended to dig every inch of it out. Detective Elena Cruz had learned that old files were like landscapes, the important details hid in the places no one bothered to look twice. She spread the ranger logs across the table, paper after paper, the faint smell of dust and copier ink rising around her. Most were routine: camping violations, noise complaints, a few citations for unauthorized drones. But she wasn't reading the obvious lines. She was watching the margins: names, locations, dates, patterns. The pattern emerged fast: artifact theft, unauthorized digging, possession of restricted relics. Claire Hensley had written more of those reports than any ranger in the district, and one name kept surfacing again and again: Caleb Voss. Each citation was careful, professional, and dated within months of her disappearance. May 2001, caught digging near old mining shaft, verbal warning. July. Fined for possession of federal artifacts. August. Confiscated equipment after repeated warnings. 3 strikes, all in the same northern sector of the park. Elena flipped to the last entry. The address listed for Voss was a small property outside Mariposa, west of the park boundary. Occupation: antique restorer, proprietor, Sierra Relic Works, a local antiques dealer. Someone who sold history one rusty nail at a time. She turned toward the cork board. Tom Hensley's giant hand-drawn map covered half the wall now, its corners held by pushpins and strips of masking tape. Trails, ravines, and forgotten shafts lined the surface in a maze of red and blue pencil. When she overlaid Claire's patrol logs and Voss's recorded dig sites, they aligned like mirror images. She exhaled through her teeth. He's been working the same ground she patrolled. Tom, standing beside her, nodded slowly. His jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Elena's voice lowered. She caught him once, maybe twice. The third time, he finished the thought for her. She told him it was over. By noon, she had requested Voss's employment verification from 2001, the alibi he'd given when Claire vanished. The old file listed him as a contractor for a mining restoration project in Fresno County. Elena made 2 calls. The company was still in business. The HR manager checked his archives and came back on the line sounding puzzled. "We've never employed a Caleb Voss," he said. "Not then. Not ever." The supposed work trip had been a fabrication. For 8 years, it had sat in the file, unquestioned. Elena closed her eyes briefly and muttered, "Of course." She wrote a note in sharp block letters: alibi false, full reinvestigation authorized. The warrant request was signed before sunset. The convoy rolled out the next morning. 2 unmarked SUVs and a county evidence van crawling along a dirt road that wound through chaparral and pine. The property sat on the edge of a ravine, a cabin weathered to the color of ash, a tin chimney leaning slightly. To one side, the yard cluttered with old mining tools, wagon parts, and steel drums. From the outside, it looked like any other collector's place, a museum someone forgot to finish. But inside, it smelled of oil, metal, and secrets. Elena stepped through the door first, flashlight cutting across the dim interior. Dust floated like ash in the beam. Every wall was lined with shelving, rows of bottles, rusted lanterns, miner's picks, porcelain shards, fragments of belt buckles tagged with handwritten labels. The space between history and theft was thin here. "Document everything," she said quietly to the evidence team. They moved methodically, photographing, tagging, sealing. Each item got a number. Each number got a line in the ledger. Elena's eyes drifted to a workbench in the corner. Tools hung above it: chisels, awls, small hammers arranged by size. One spot on the pegboard was empty, a square of clean wood where dust hadn't settled. "Something missing," she murmured. A deputy pointed toward the far side of the bench. "We've got one down here, ma'am." Half buried under a tarp was a wooden crate filled with scrap tools, broken handles, dulled blades, a bent shovel. On top of the pile lay a rock hammer, the head thick with rust, its tip sheared clean off. Elena picked it up carefully, turning it under the light. The steel was pitted, but solid. The break was fresh once, sharp and splintered, not worn smooth by time. "Bag it," she said. "Priority 1." At the mobile lab, later that afternoon, the comparison was instant. Under magnification, the tungsten carbide tip of the recovered hammer revealed a jagged edge identical to the fragment extracted from Echo's bone. The chemical composition matched to the decimal. It was the same tool, the same strike, the same moment that had taken Claire's life. Elena stood over the lab table, arms folded, staring down at the hammer as if it might explain itself. The tech beside her read the report aloud in clipped scientific rhythm. "Fragment 09B27, tungsten carbide with cobalt binder, consistent with geological hammerhead, origin of breakage, high impact force against hard organic surface, trace soil residue, consistent with Yosemite Valley granite." Elena said nothing for a while. Then quietly, 8 years, all that searching, and it comes down to $80 in steel. They searched the rest of the cabin, room by room. Behind a canvas curtain lay what Voss called his archive. Hundreds of artifacts were arranged on narrow tables: glass bottles, mining claim markers, rusted axes, tin plates stamped with 19th century maker's marks. Each was numbered, each cross-referenced to a ledger. Elena flipped through the book. It was meticulous. Years of excavation records, written in neat pencil. At first it looked legitimate until she noticed the coordinates. Several matched restricted zones inside the park, places federal law forbade anyone to dig, and the last entry, dated September 22nd, 2001, listed a new site: North Ridge, quartz seam near dry ravine. The same week Claire vanished, she looked up. He was still digging when she found him. Outside, the evening light was fading behind the hills. The search team packed evidence crates into the van: gloves, bags, labeled boxes. Elena stayed on the porch, staring out across the slope. The air smelled of sage and old iron. She tried to picture it, Claire riding up the trail, catching sight of a truck half hidden among the pines. A man bent over a dig, startled when she called his name. A badge, a warning, a raised hand. Then the hammer, one swing, fueled by panic and the terror of being caught again. For years, the wilderness had been accused of taking her, but it wasn't the mountain that killed Claire Hensley. It was greed, small, ordinary human greed. Elena turned as Tom approached from the drive. His expression was still unreadable. She held up the evidence bag containing the hammer. The light caught the metal through the plastic, a dull glint that looked almost harmless. "This is it," she said softly. "The piece that broke both of them." Tom stared at the bag for a long time, his voice barely audible. "She fought men like him her whole life." "She won," Elena said. "It just took 8 years for the world to catch up." He nodded once, slow, deliberate. The evening wind lifted the edge of his jacket, carrying the faint scent of pine from the valley below. Behind them, the cabin stood in shadow, shelves of stolen history waiting for cataloging, the quiet confession of a man who thought the earth would keep his secrets, but the earth had already spoken. It had given up the metal, the bones, and the silence between them. And now, for the first time since the radio went dead in 2001, the story of Ranger Claire Hensley was no longer lost in static. The room was small, square, and stripped of comfort. Gray walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a faint hum from the air vent. Detective Elena Cruz sat on one side, hands folded, a digital recorder glowing red in front of her. Across from her, Caleb Voss stared at his reflection in the polished tabletop, the face of a man who had spent 8 years pretending to forget. He looked ordinary, flannel shirt, work boots, dirt still under his nails from a life spent digging. When the arrest team had brought him in, he hadn't fought. He hadn't even asked why. Now, under the flicker of the fluorescent light, that calm began to fray. Elena pressed the button. Interview begins. Time, 8:42 a.m., June 11th, 2009. Subject, Caleb Voss. Her voice was steady. His hands weren't. "Mr. Voss," she began, "you told Rangers in 2001 you were in Fresno for work when Ranger Claire Hensley disappeared. We've confirmed that was false." He said nothing. She opened a folder, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed the hammer, rusted, broken, sealed in plastic. "This was found in your workshop. The missing tip matches the fragment in her horse's bone." He stared at the image for a long moment, lips pressed tight. His throat worked once before words came out, hoarse, low. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Elena didn't react. She let the silence breathe. He spoke again, voice cracking like a hinge. "I was out there for days. I found a patch of tailings, old quartz seams from the mining camps. You can still pull stuff out, belt buckles, bottles, even coins if you're lucky. She rode up while I was digging. Quiet. Didn't shout, didn't draw her gun. Just looked at me like—" He stopped, searching for something in his memory. "Like she already knew I'd run out of excuses." "What did she say?" Elena asked softly. He swallowed. "She said I was under arrest. Told me to drop the tools. Said she'd called it in." The air in the room thickened. The only sound was the faint whine of the recorder. "I panicked," he said. "I'd been fined before. Another one and I'd lose my license, my shop, everything I'd built. I begged her, told her I'd fill the hole, I'd walk out. Nobody had to know. She wouldn't have it. She reached for her radio and I—" He stopped again. His fingers curled into fists. "I just swung. Once, I swear to God, just once." The words landed like a dull echo in the room. "She dropped," he whispered. didn't even make a sound. The horse, Echo, started thrashing, screaming. I thought someone would hear. I I didn't think. I just kept swinging until it stopped. Elena closed her eyes briefly. She didn't interrupt. Caleb leaned forward, voice trembling now. After that, everything was quiet. Just me, the dirt, and her lying there. I knew what I'd done. I knew what it meant. He described it mechanically, as though speaking through someone else's mouth. He dug a pit for the horse first, 4 feet deep, methodical, as if covering up a mistake in the ground could undo what he'd done above it. Then he turned to Claire. I couldn't bury her there. Someone would find it. The soil was too soft, too close to the trail. There was this fissure, a crack in the rock face a half-mile west, behind a wall of manzanita and poison oak. I'd found it years before while scouting. No one ever goes near it. I thought it was perfect. He stared at his hands as he spoke, as if seeing them for the first time. I carried her there, wrapped her jacket around her face so I wouldn't have to look. It took hours. When I dropped her in, she didn't make a sound. The forest didn't either. He stopped talking then, just breathing, eyes unfocused. Elena finally leaned forward. Show us. The next morning, a convoy moved through the northern back country, marked SUVs, forensic trucks, and a rescue team in bright orange harnesses. Tom Hensley rode in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, staring straight ahead, hands clasped so tight the knuckles blanched white. They reached the site just before noon. The air was heavy with pine and sun-warmed stone. Caleb, handcuffed and flanked by deputies, led the way up a narrow deer path. He moved slowly, head down, chains whispering against his boots. This way, he muttered, pointing toward a tangle of brush at the base of a granite outcrop. The rescuers hacked through vines and thorn. Hidden behind the thicket was a narrow fissure, no wider than a doorway, black as the inside of a cave. The air that seeped from it was cool and damp, smelling faintly of earth and time. They set up anchors on the nearby trees, tested ropes, adjusted harnesses. A rescuer named Gavin checked his radio twice before clipping into the line. Descent in progress, he said. Tom stood at the edge, helmet in his hands, eyes fixed on the darkness below. Elena stood beside him. The rope hissed softly through the pulley system. Passin' 20 feet, Gavin's voice crackled through the radio. The others listened in silence, every word amplified by the stillness of the forest. 40 feet, narrowing passage, walls stable. Hold on. A pause, then a long exhale. I have visual. Elena's hand tightened around the radio. Confirm? Gavin's voice came back, softer now. We have her. No one spoke. The wind moved gently through the pines above, carrying a faint metallic scent from the fissure. Soil and stone, old and final. They worked for nearly an hour to bring her up, inch by careful inch. When the recovery bag emerged from the fissure's mouth, everyone fell silent. It was lowered onto a tarp, the zipper gleaming under filtered sunlight. Inside, the coroner's team worked quietly. They confirmed the uniform fragments, the equipment belt, and finally pinned over the left breast a tarnished ranger badge still bearing the name C. Hensley. Tom knelt beside it. He didn't cry. The tears had long since been spent. He just placed a hand against the canvas, feeling the weight of years collapse into a single, terrible stillness. She came home, he whispered. Elena stepped back, giving him space. The forest seemed to listen. Even the birds held their distance, as though the mountain itself recognized the moment. The deputies escorted Caleb away, his head bowed, chains clinking softly in the dirt. He didn't look back. For Tom, there was nothing left to chase, No trails to follow, no maps to redraw. The mountain had finally given his daughter back, and with her, the truth that had hidden in silence for nearly a decade. The recovery team folded the tarp corners with care. The badge glinted once in the light before disappearing beneath the cover. Elena looked toward the horizon, the vast sweep of Yosemite's granite and sky, and said quietly, almost to herself, she kept her promise. She never left the park. Tom didn't answer. He didn't need to, because in that moment, as the sun broke through the trees and the wind rose softly across the ridge, the wilderness, vast, unforgiving, and eternal, finally exhaled the truth it had buried for 8 long years. The trial didn't last long. 8 years of silence had already written most of the evidence. When Caleb Voss stood before the court, he didn't look defiant anymore, just hollow, the kind of emptiness that comes from being seen for what you are. The prosecution laid it out in quiet, devastating order: the forged alibi, the stolen artifacts, the tungsten carbide fragment, the buried horse, the confession. The jury took less than 3 hours, guilty of first-degree murder, life without the possibility of parole. When the judge read the sentence, Voss barely lifted his head. The chains around his wrists rattled once, then went still. In the gallery, Tom Hensley sat in the back row, hands clasped, eyes forward. He didn't flinch, didn't breathe relief, didn't look at the man who had taken his daughter's life. For him, justice wasn't noise. It was the simple act of truth finally being said out loud. In the months that followed, Yosemite began to heal in its own quiet way. The ravine where Echo had been found was closed to the public, marked off by low fencing and a single wooden sign, site of the 2000 album Hensley case, preserved for study and memory. Below it, in smaller letters, dedicated to the men and women who protect our national parks, often unseen, always steadfast. The area was later added to the ranger training tours, not as spectacle, but as lesson. The new recruits learned to read the terrain, to trust instinct over comfort, to understand that danger doesn't always announce itself with teeth or thunder. Sometimes it waits with human hands and a single bad decision. Detective Elena Cruz stood at the dedication ceremony that fall. She didn't speak. She just watched the sunlight creep through the trees and touch the marker's brass plate. It glowed faintly, like something old and sacred remembering its purpose. Tom came every year. He moved slower now, but the park still knew him. The trails he and Claire had walked together were etched into his memory deeper than any map. Sometimes he guided the younger rangers through those same paths, quiet kids with notebooks and eager eyes. They'd listen as he pointed out hidden washes, how water reshapes the land, how shadows change the sense of direction. He never spoke about the case directly, not unless someone asked, but when he stopped at a ridge and looked out across the forest, his words always carried the same message. Never underestimate the quiet parts of the park. They'll tell you things the loud places never will. To him, it wasn't just about safety. It was about respect, about remembering that the wilderness doesn't bend easily to human understanding. The forest, indifferent and eternal, had held his daughter's secret for 8 long years, not out of malice, but out of patience. It had waited until someone was willing to listen. One summer evening, Tom returned to the northern sector alone. He hiked until the light turned gold and, then sat near the edge of the ravine where Echo's remains had been found. The excavation site was gone now, grass grown over, the soil smooth again. Only the faint outlines of the preservation fence remained. He took a small metal badge from his pocket, the spare one Claire had left at home all those years ago. The enamel was faded. the edges worn by his thumb. He placed it gently in the earth beside him and whispered something the wind carried away before it could be heard. For the first time in years, he didn't look lost, just quiet. Back at the ranger headquarters, a new plaque hung near the door. It showed Claire's photograph, her in uniform, standing beside her horse, eyes steady, a hint of sun in her hair. Below, the inscription read, Ranger Claire Hensley, 1972 2001. She spent her life protecting the land from those who wanted to take from it. In the end, the land protected her secret until it was ready to be told. Visitors stopped to read it sometimes, unaware that the man tending the nearby trail paths was her father. Tom would nod politely, then go back to his work, trimming brush or setting markers, his expression peaceful in the late afternoon light. Elena visited once more before she transferred out of the unit. She found Tom by the fence line, hands rough, hat pulled low against the sun. They didn't talk about the case or the trial. Instead, she asked quietly, "Do you ever hear the static?" He smiled faintly. "Not anymore." That night, the valley was still. The radios at headquarters buzzed and crackled softly as the evening roll call began. The same ritual that had once started everything. One by one, the voices of the Rangers answered in. Ranger 1, all clear. Ranger 2, all clear. Ranger 3, all clear. The final call sign came through last. Ranger 6, all clear. The dispatcher paused, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his face. Somewhere out there, the forest whispered back with its own kind of reply. Wind through pines, water against stone, the language of things that endure. The screen fades to black as the narration returns, low and quiet, like an echo returning through static. She spent her life protecting the land from those who wanted to take from it. In the end, the land protected her secret until it was ready to be told. And then one final line, the same one that opened it all, the line that lingers like a radio gone silent in the dark. When the static finally stopped, so did every trace of her. The wilderness never forgets. It just waits. For every mystery it swallows, it holds a truth beneath the roots and stone, patient as time itself. Claire Hensley's story isn't just about what was lost. It's about what the earth remembers when no one else does, because out here, in the silence between the static, some stories never end.